You're listening to Andrew Haunt's Rock Revival with me, Andrew Haunt. This will be my last episode of the year. Sorry about the break there, it has been a little while since I put an episode out, but life has got in the way. So for next year, I am going to look at a better way of scheduling these episodes so they're a lot more consistent for you and come out on a more regular basis. So for this episode, for this final episode of 2021, it had to be something special, didn't it really? So for this episode, I am covering the 12th studio album by Judas Priest, Painkiller. Before we get to Painkiller though, if you're not familiar with myself, if you're not familiar with the show, if this is your first time here, I'm Andrew Haunt. I am a rock and metal fan that have been for a very, very long time. I like a lot of other different kinds of music as well. It's synthwave and dark electro and goth and things like that, but mainly I am a rock and metalhead at heart and will always be thus. I used to write for POWERPLAY rock and metal magazine here in the UK, where I got to interview loads of really cool bands. I got to hang out with loads of really cool bands and got to hear a lot of music. Now, throughout my life, I have before and after working for the magazine, loved to hang out with musicians and loved to just delve into the wonders of the rock and metal scene. Now, in the early days of that, Painkiller was a remarkably powerful and definitive album for me at the time. So, Painkiller was my first exposure to Judas Priest. So a lot of people would come on Judas Priest with things like Breaking the Law or the album Sad Wings of Destiny or maybe Stained Class. For me, it was Painkiller. I'd seen the video on an episode of Raw Power. If you're not familiar with what Raw Power was, that was shown at about 3:30 in the morning after The Hitman and Her here in the UK on ITV, where we would, as rock and metal fans, would get an entire hour at 3:30 in the morning of stuff we wanted to watch. How times change. You know, this is before the era of really MTV being available in the UK. It was way before the internet gave rise to things like YouTube and so on, and Spotify. So that was how we got our fix of TV-based rock and metal. Granted, there were magazines out, Kerrang, Metal Hammer and the sort, Raw, I remember Raw, and all those sort of things, but it was nice to see something visual as well sometimes. And I saw the video to Painkiller on an episode of Raw Power once, and that song just floored me. The sound of it, the power of it, it's just it's one of, if not the purest heavy metal songs ever recorded. What took me a little bit by surprise was Rob Halford's voice. As remember, this is the first time I'd heard Judas Priest really when I was a kid. This was about 1991. 1990, 1991, and Rob's piercing falsetto voice, he was using the highest of high voices on Painkiller, was a bit of a surprise. And I wasn't sure what was going on at first, but then as the song progressed and it got to that solo, oh my god, that solo, I got it. This was full on. This was why Judas Priest was such a name to be reckoned with, why they were so iconic. Already by that time, they were extremely iconic in the scene. So, at the time, it was the era of grunge. As I mentioned on previous episodes, the era of grunge and alternative rock and things were in full swing, and it really wasn't for me at the time. I've grown to like a lot of those things as I've got older, but at the time, I needed something a bit more straightforward, a bit more pure, and a bit more exciting, to be honest. So, Painkiller, I found in HMV in their sales section on vinyl for $3.99. Now, since those heady days of 1991, I got. I've also had it on CD and download, but I still have my original vinyl, and it is a prized possession of mine. I'm not going to get rid of that. Just the fact that I've got the original vinyl with that glorious artwork on it in full size. All of its splendor to enjoy is a wonderful, wonderful thing, and I will never part with that album. I love it dearly. So, the album itself, it was at a point in Judas Priest's career where they wanted to push everything about their sound up to 11 in full-on Spinal Tap mode and just make the most metal album ever. The stuff they put out before that had been perfectly serviceable. It had definitely given them the iconic status that they had earned. They'd earned all of the praise, but Painkiller, it took it up a notch and it really blew a lot of people away. So on the cover we have the Painkiller itself, a chromium-clad godlike superhero with metallic wings riding a dragon-headed motorbike through the skies, which has saw blades for wheels. And behind him we have what looks like the apocalypse as the Judas Priest logo is emerging out of the ground where cities fall into a lava pit of hell. So that's a pretty metal cover. That is a pretty damn metal cover. Inside the album was just spectacular. So the lineup for this album, this was Rob Halford on vocals, Ian Hill on bass, KK Downing on guitar, Scott Travis on drums, and Glenn Tipton on guitar as well. Now that, for many, or for me at least, that is the definitive Judas Priest lineup. That is the lineup that sums everything up perfectly for me about this band, and I love it. Sadly, this was to be Rob Halford's final album with the band for a little while. And he went on to be in Fight, and then 2, and then the Halford Project, and eventually he did come back to Painkiller, to Judas Priest, in spectacular fashion. But yeah, this was the last album that Judas Priest did before Rob was eventually replaced by Tim Ripper Owens for Jugulator and Demolition. I may cover those as well at some point, back to back, because looking back, you know, a lot of people have issues with the Ripper Owens era, saying it wasn't really Priest, it wasn't really what people wanted. But if you look back at those albums, they are kick-ass. They are great albums, no matter what anyone says. So the album Painkiller is what this episode is about. So I'm going to go through the tracks for that album. So opening it, in all 6 minutes and 5 seconds of its glory, is the song Painkiller, the title track itself. It comes in with Scott Travis beating you to death over the head with the drum kit, which then gives rise to the huge scream of guitars, bringing in the riffs from KK and Glenn. And of course, then it all kicks in with Ian Hill's bass and Rob Halford's screeching vocals. It is, honestly, I do think it is the greatest metal song ever made. It's ridiculous, it's over the top, it's lengthy, it's just a very exciting song. And it is brutal. I can imagine it must be brutal to perform. I mean, it's brutal to listen to because it does not let up. There's no like slow parts. It's all paced. There's a hell of a lot of double bass drumming. So Scott must have been knackered. But there's solos that are just ridiculous. And KK Downing's solo is very good in the second half of the solo. But Glenn Tipton's solo, the first half of the lengthy lead guitar part in Painkiller, is my favourite solo of all time. It's just mwah. It's just absolutely impeccable. It screams. There's sweeping in there. There's shredding in there. It just captures everything that you could possibly want from a metal song. As that ends, it can only go downhill from Painkiller, really. And Hell Patrol, which is like half the length of Painkiller, is a great song. It's a great song, but it doesn't have the impact of Painkiller itself. To be honest, I don't think anything could have the same impact of Painkiller. So it had to be followed by something, and Hell Patrol is a very perfectly serviceable song. It's a really memorable chorus, nice sing-along tune to it. This is picked up again on All Guns Blazing, track 3. To be honest, I think that may have been a better track too, but then again, it could be a little bit too similar to Painkiller in terms of pace. So that's quite a fierce metal song as well. That's followed by Leather Rebel, which quite memorable. It does have a big chorus to it, but not on the same level as Painkiller or All Guns Blazing. After Leather Rebel, there comes the cheesiest song, I think the cheesiest song of the entire album, but it works in the context of the Painkiller album. It totally works, and that is Metal Meltdown. Here comes the Metal Meltdown, run for your life. Here comes the Metal Meltdown, no one survives. I can't remember the exact lyric, I believe that's it. But it's very cheesy, it's very corny, it's cliche-ridden, but it works in the context of Painkiller. If you hear it outside of the context of Painkiller, I can see people making fun of that song a little bit, but which is a shame because I love it, it kicks ass. After that is Nightcrawler. That does have a really, really great hook to it that picks up the pace a little bit. It's a little more sinister. It's a little more sinister than what's come before, which was kind of straightforward, fist-punching metal. Nightcrawler has a bit of a darker feel to it, and that works. That is followed by Between the Hammer and the Anvil. Another great song. But again, it's kind of hard to say anything bad about any of the songs on this album, because any song off this is just brilliant. The solos are over the top. The production of it, while the guitars can be a little thin, they work. Rob Halford's voice is fantastic. It's hard to say anything bad about the album, because you've got things on there like Painkiller and All Guns Blazing, which are just glorious. So, Between the Hammer and the Anvil, not a bad song at all, but not quite on the level of what came before. However, that is followed by A Touch of Evil. Now, while it is filled with keyboards and a more mid-paced tempo, the utter malevolence of this song and the spooky atmospherics of it, it just conjures up so many images in the mind while you listen to it, and it's just glorious. There is something haunting about the chorus hook to it. The solo takes you by surprise in that it's a lot more flashy than you would usually associate with a song of this nature, and it is just a thing of beauty. Next to Painkiller and Nightcrawler, that is the longest song on the album so far, at 5 minutes 43, but that is just wonderful. When you get towards the end and you've got Rob screaming, "You're possessing me!" I shouldn't try and sound like Rob Halford on this, that's a bad idea. And then the chorus kicks back in, but when you've got that moment just of Rob's voice screeching that, and then the entire band comes back in for a repetition of the chorus, it's so impactful, extremely powerful, and I love it. That really holds up as being something that has stood the test of time. That is a great song. And A Touch of Evil, it eclipses All Guns Blazing as the next song down in quality stakes next to Painkiller itself. So Painkiller and Touch of Evil, by far the best songs on this album. That is followed by Battle Hymn, which is a 56-second intro piece, interlude. It's like a musical interlude. It's quite sinister, it's nice and atmospheric. It does sound a little bit like a loading screen for an old, like a Dungeons and Dragons themed video game or something like that, but it's fine. That leads into One Shot at Glory, which ended the original version of the album at 6 minutes 46 seconds long. One Shot at Glory, and it kind of feels like a greatest hits package of what's come before with the rest of the Painkiller album. But it works, and it nicely rounds off what is a ridiculous, over-the-top, full-on, balls to the wall, foot to the floor, pedal to the metal, all the other cliches you can think of, metal album. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. Now, on the CD reissue of this that I have, it does come with 2 bonus tracks. One of those being Living Bad Dreams, which was a song originally left off the album, and it's not bad. It's along the same lines of Touch of Evil in terms of pace. It's not a fast song. It's one of the darker, more brooding, malevolent songs that they did, and it's not bad at all. But I can see why it was left off Painkiller. It doesn't quite have the X factor of the other material that was on the finished album. Now, something that did interest me was the other bonus track on this CD reissue of Painkiller is Leather Rebel. So it's track 4 from the album, as mentioned, but it is a live version of that. And what I noticed with that is that the Painkiller era guitar tones of Judas Priest, while they sound great on the album, when you hear the live recording, it is lacking something. It sounds like the guitars haven't got the volume control turned all the way up. It sounds like the volume pot's on about 7 or so. All the distortions there, the overdrive, the gain and everything, but it just sounds like there's not enough crunch to those guitars when live. So this was something that was remedied in quite grand style on what came after with Jugulator eventually. But yeah, on this particular album, it sounds great in studio, but live it did sound a little bit weak. That may just be the live recording, or it could be down to the tone itself. But I think it's possibly a bit of both, leaning towards more that it's a bit of a weak tone for live playing. But it sounds fantastic on the album. It works extremely well. This is an album that has lasted for a very long time. Bear in mind that this came out in when was it? It was summer 1990. This came out. And it's now winter 2021, 1,005,097 years later, and it still holds up well. I still play this regularly. Painkiller is still getting listens all over the world. Touch of Evil is still getting listens all over the world. If you check out Spotify or YouTube or anything like that, there's still a lot of action going on with those recordings. And it's just, for me, it epitomizes a particular era in metal where it was sort of the last gasp for a certain type of it before it moved on to harder things. Yeah, grunge was going on. Grunge was the big thing, but there was a lot of things building up. You know, it wasn't too far off things like Chaos AD by Sepultura being released, or Burn My Eyes, and then you've got things like Demanufacture, Burn My Eyes by Machine Head, and then Demanufacture by Fear Factory, and so on, and everything got a lot darker and a lot heavier. Painkiller feels like the apex of traditional heavy metal to me, and it changed my life back in the day, and it continues to be an absolute banger of an album here and now in 2021. I have a movie idea based around the Painkiller itself. I'm not going to reveal that here because, you know, get your own ideas, but it's just it's an evocative cover. It's an evocative sound. And the fact that they just drove everything past the extreme in terms of what they could do, and their songwriting and the musicianship, they just created something truly, truly spectacular and wonderful. Painkiller is by far my favourite Judas Priest album. I don't think anything else tops it. Certainly none of the things they did since then have topped it, and as that was my first exposure to the band back in 1991 when I got it reduced, what a thing to find in a sale. It will always be what Judas Priest sound like in my head. I know things like Ram It Down were a bit more like that came before it, but for me, Painkiller is perfect. And I know I've been critical of some of the songs, but it's really hard to be critical about this album for me, because it is just so consistently good and so far beyond a lot of other bands' output that finding fault with it is really hard. So I've had to find those little faults, those little niggles, those little issues, just in terms of the album itself, rather than in the larger rock and metal scene. It was recorded in France and the Netherlands, of all places. I thought it was recorded in England for some reason. It was produced by Chris Tsagarides, and that is the late great Chris Tsagarides, and he was a great loss to the metal community. It was lovely to see him pop up in the Anvil documentary, Anvil, A True Story of Anvil. I must cover some Anvil at some point, because I've got some good stories about Anvil. But yeah, Painkiller by Judas Priest. Truly one of the greatest heavy metal albums ever recorded. It's just brilliant in every way. If you get past the first track, where Rob Halford is really going for it with the screamed vocals, not all of the album is like that. There are moments where he gets that high again, where he goes that far, pushing his voice, but it's only on Painkiller, the song itself, where it is basically for the entire tune. And I feel for Rob Halford, having had to sing that song for the last 31 years, you know, on and off, because it must be so taxing. Thankfully, Rob's voice has been in great shape in recent years. He had a period where it wasn't so great, where you could see he was struggling with things, and replaced some of the higher notes in Painkiller with death metal vocals, of all things. If you see some of the live videos, it actually works kind of well. But he did get a lot of that power back from more recent albums like Firepower. Firepower's great. It's a great album. But anyway, this isn't about the present, this is about the past, this is about the favourites, this is about nostalgia over these classic rock and metal albums, and Painkiller will always be one of my finest albums ever, one of my most favourite albums of all time, and long may it reign. So that's my little look at Painkiller by Judas Priest. I had to end the year on something special. I will be back in 2022 with new episodes of Andrew Haunt's Rock Revival, as well as a load of stuff on my YouTube channel. If you don't follow me on my YouTube channel, I put out pop culture videos about movies, games, books, sci-fi, the writing life, and a bunch of other stuff that I can think of, whatever takes my fancy, really. So do check that out. There's also a version of this podcast on my YouTube channel as well, just with an image over it. If you'd rather listen on YouTube, that's fine, go for it, knock yourself out. Well, don't, because then you miss the stuff I'm saying. Anyway, I hope you have a brilliant end to your 2021, and I look forward to catching up with you in 2022 for more rock and metal shenanigans. I'm Andrew Haunt, this is my Rock Revival.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and validate my existence.